Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in 2026. Your paycheck hits. By lunch, half of it is already mentally gone. The rent or mortgage is fixed. The grocery bill is not. Insurance jumped again. Your credit card isn't maxed out, but it's never really empty. Your 401k looks okay on paper, but somehow your real life feels tighter than it did a year ago. And then your company freezes hiring. Not layoffs, just silence. No raises, no backfill, no certainty. That's the kind of economy that blindsides people. Not the movie version collapse with bank runs and screaming anchors, the more dangerous version. The one that keeps functioning just well enough for most people to stay calm, while their options quietly disappear. And if you think the biggest risk to your money in 2026 is a classic recession, a stock crash, or some obvious emergency, you may be looking in the wrong direction. Because the real threat is that the US economy doesn't break cleanly. It bends. It drags. It reshuffles. It punishes the unprepared in slow motion. But here's the real problem. Most people are still preparing for the last crisis. They're watching for a housing crash like 2008, or a sudden pandemic-style shutdown, or a giant market wipeout that gives them a clear signal to react. That's not how this version works. This version hits in layers. A job market that looks stable on the surface, but gets harder to survive inside. Inflation that is no longer shocking enough to make headlines every day, but still high enough to keep chewing through savings. A housing market that doesn't crash, but traps people in place. Consumer debt that doesn't implode everywhere at once, but cracks first in the households with the least room for error. And above all of it, a federal balance sheet so stretched that even small moves in rates can ripple through mortgages, business loans, taxes, and the dollar itself. Now this matters because the latest numbers already show the ingredients are here. Real GDP in the first quarter of 2026 grew at just 1.6%. April CPI was up 3.8% from a year earlier, with energy up 17.9%, food up 3.2%, and shelter up 3.3%. The unemployment rate in May held at 4.3%, which sounds fine, but long-term unemployment rose to 2 million and is up by 524,000 over the year. Total household debt reached $18.8 trillion in the first quarter, with 4.8% of debt in some stage of delinquency. Meanwhile, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate was still around 6.48% in early June, and CBO projects a 2026 federal deficit of $1.9 trillion. Debt held by the public at 101% of GDP, and net interest outlays above $1 trillion. That is not a normal backdrop. That is a pressure system. BLS, BEA, New York Fed, Freddie Mac, CBO. And this is when most people get it wrong. They hear GDP still growing and think safe. They hear unemployment only 4.3% and think stable. They hear inflation came down from the peak and think solved. But survival is not about averages. It's about exposure. So let's count down the 5 scenarios nobody is really preparing for in the USA economy in 2026. Number 5 is the housing freeze. Not a housing crash, a housing freeze. That distinction matters more than people realize. A crash is obvious. Prices fall, headlines turn dramatic, buyers wait, sellers panic. Everyone knows the game has changed. A freeze is worse for everyday life in a quieter way. People stay locked in. Families don't move when they should. Job opportunities get ignored. because the housing math no longer works. Young buyers delay forming households. Older owners delay downsizing. Inventory stays tight. Mobility drops. The ladder stops functioning. Redfin says the lock-in effect is reshaping movement patterns in 2026, with more homeowners staying put because they don't want to give up their old mortgage rate. Freddie Mac's survey still has the average 30-year mortgage around 6.48% in early June 2026. So if you refinanced into 3% money a few years ago, moving is no longer a lifestyle decision. It's a balance sheet event. Redfin, Freddie Mac. And that creates a chain reaction most people don't price in. When fewer people sell, inventory stays restricted. When inventory stays restricted, prices don't reset enough to restore affordability. When prices don't reset, first-time buyers stretch harder. When first-time buyers stretch harder, their margin for error disappears. So the risk is not simply homes become unaffordable. The deeper risk is that housing becomes less flexible. You can't move closer to work without paying more. You can't easily size up for a growing family. You can't easily size down to cut costs. You can't reposition your life without taking a financial hit. That turns housing from an asset into a trap. Here's what history shows. In 1981, mortgage rates climbed above 18%. Today's rates are nowhere near that, but the lesson is the same. Once financing becomes the story, the house price alone stops telling you anything useful. Payment becomes destiny. Freddie Mac's own long-term rate history still points back to that era for a reason. Freddie Mac. And for millions of Americans, 2026 is not the year of, "Can I buy a home?" It's the year of, "Can I survive the payment path I'm locking myself into?" If you're unprepared for this scenario, you make the classic mistake. You anchor on the listing price and ignore the total mobility cost. Insurance, taxes, maintenance, financing, commute shifts, repair inflation, even the opportunity cost of being stuck in the wrong city. The practical rule here is simple. Do not buy based on hope of a future refinance. Do not assume inventory magically improves. And do not measure affordability by whether you can barely get approved. Measure it by whether you could survive that payment if your income stalled for 12 months. Because, in a frozen housing market, the danger is not just overpaying. It's becoming immobile at exactly the wrong moment. Number 4 is the quiet consumer fracture. This is the scenario that looks harmless in the aggregate and dangerous in the household. The headline version says, consumers are still spending. Debt growth in the first quarter of 2026 was modest. Credit card balances even dipped seasonally. The real version says, stress is becoming more selective, more targeted, and more permanent. The New York Fed says total household debt reached $18.794 trillion in Q1 2026. Aggregate delinquency was 4.8%. Flow into serious delinquency for all debt rose to 2.83%, up from 2.45% a year earlier. Mortgage flow into serious delinquency rose from 1.22% to 1.48%. Student loan flow into serious delinquency climbed to 10.86%, and the student loan delinquency rate rose to 10.3% of balances 90-plus days delinquent. About 2.6 million student loan borrowers, more than 120 days past due, had their loans transferred to the Department of Education's Default Resolution Group. New York Fed. That is not the consumer is fine. That is a two-speed economy. One group still spends because asset values, higher incomes, and locked-in financing protect them. Another group gets squeezed by everything variable at once: food, energy, transport, insurance, rent, interest, and now the return of student loan consequences. And this is where most people get it wrong. They assume debt stress becomes dangerous only when everyone is under pressure at the same time. No. In real life, financial breaks start at the margins. Then they spread through lenders, retailers, landlords, local governments, and employers. If a middle-income household has to restart student loan payments, cover a higher insurance premium, and roll a balance at elevated card interest, they don't need a catastrophe to become unstable. They just need one appliance failure, one medical bill, one reduction in hours, one missed side gig month. That is how the quiet fracture works. You won't always see it first in the market. You'll see it in skipped maintenance, in rising roommate arrangements, in delayed weddings, in people driving older cars longer, in parents moving money to adult children, in subscriptions quietly getting cancelled, in "I'm doing okay," meaning "I'm one bad month away." Now, this matters because weak consumers don't collapse cleanly either. They downgrade. They stop buying full price. They stop replacing. They shift to discount stores. They finance essentials. They borrow against tomorrow to keep today looking normal. And if enough households do that together, you get a strange economy. Sales volumes wobble. Defaults rise unevenly. Business forecasts get harder, and employers start cutting at the edges. No fireworks, just brittleness. The action rule here is brutally practical. Treat available credit like a defensive resource, not a lifestyle enhancer. If you can refinance or simplify any high-interest debt, do it before your profile worsens. If your income depends on commissions, tips, gig work, or freelance cycles, build cash first, not status purchases. And if you may need a credit line later, secure flexibility while your numbers still look decent. Because once the fracture becomes visible, lenders stop rewarding caution and start pricing fear. Number 3 is the labor market slowdown that doesn't feel like a recession until it's already inside your house. This might be the most misunderstood risk on the list, because the labor market headline still sounds okay. The US added 172,000 payroll jobs in May 2026. The unemployment rate stayed at 4.3%. Average hourly earnings were up 3.4% over the year. On paper, that sounds like a soft landing. But look underneath. Long-term unemployment is up by 524,000 over the year. Financial activities employment is down by 107,000 since May 2025. Transportation and warehousing is down by 92,000 since its peak in February 2025. Labor force participation is stuck at 61.8%, and 4.8 million people are still working part-time for economic reasons. That's not a booming labor market. That's a labor market losing quality before it loses the headline. And here's why that is so dangerous. Most households know how to emotionally prepare for job loss. They do not know how to prepare for job stagnation. The email that says hiring is paused, the bonus that gets deferred, the promotion path that vanishes, the recruiter messages that suddenly stop, the contract renewal that becomes month to month, the office role that still exists but now gets split between one person, software, and an overseas team. That kind of labor market doesn't cause panic right away. It causes hesitation. People stop taking risks. They stop moving. They stop spending. They stop negotiating. They accept worse terms because optionality feels scarce. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think employment risk starts when layoffs begin. No. Employment risk starts when bargaining power disappears. A worker with a paycheck but no leverage is already in a weaker economy. If you're in finance, back office, logistics, administration, customer support, middle management, or any role touched by automation, margin compression, or restructuring, you don't need to be fired to feel the pressure. You just need your replacement options to thin out while your living costs stay elevated. That's the trap. You remain employed enough to avoid alarm, but not secure enough to plan. And once enough people live in that zone, the economy slows from the inside out. Here's what history shows. Before major downturns become obvious in data, they often show up first as hiring weakness, reduced hours, narrower opportunities, and a longer path back to good jobs. Long-term unemployment matters because it tells you who is not bouncing back quickly. Once that group grows, recovery becomes less evenly distributed. So what do? You stop defining job security by your current employer's mood. You build income redundancy. You update the resume before you need it. You document achievements while you still have access. You strengthen relationships outside your company. You learn one skill that either saves a business money, makes a business money, or helps a business stay compliant. Because in a soft labor slowdown, titles matter less than usefulness. And the households that survive best in that environment are not always the highest earners. They are the fastest adapters. Number 2 is stagflation light. Not full 1970s chaos, not runaway inflation, not a formal collapse in growth. Something more annoying and more believable. A slow growth economy where the prices that matter most to normal people refuse to cool enough. BEA says real GDP grew at a 1.6% annual rate in the first quarter of 2026. BLS says April CPI ran at 3.8% year-over-year. Energy was up 17.9%. Food was up 3.2%. Shelter was up 3.3%. Core inflation was 2.8%. In May, average hourly earnings were up 3.4% year-over-year. So you don't need a PhD to see the issue. For a lot of households, the cost categories that feel unavoidable are still running hot, while income growth is no longer giving much breathing room. BEA, BLS, BLS. Now this matters because people keep waiting for inflation to feel over. But inflation doesn't have to be extreme to damage you. It just has to outpace your ability to adjust. If gasoline spikes, you can't instantly redesign your commute. If groceries rise, you can trade down, but only so far. If shelter stays expensive, you don't cancel housing the way you cancel a streaming service. If insurance keeps climbing, you notice it late and feel it all year. That's why stagflation light is so corrosive. It doesn't produce a dramatic headline every day. It produces 1,000 smaller decisions that all make life narrower. You drive less. You buy less fresh food. You postpone dental work. You stop building savings. You keep the emergency fund smaller than it should be because the month keeps eating it. And here's the psychological trick. Because the economy is still technically growing, people doubt their own stress. They think, maybe I'm just bad with money. No. Sometimes the macro environment is simply hostile to ordinary planning. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think inflation is only a problem when asset markets are crashing and the news is screaming. In reality, moderate but sticky inflation can do more damage to middle-class confidence than a quick shock, because it trains people to normalize decline. That's the part you have to fight. Here's what history shows. In the 1970s, households learned the hard way that when growth slows and essentials stay expensive, both cash and confidence erode fast. You do not need 1979-level inflation to repeat the emotional effect. You just need daily life to stay more expensive than your income assumptions. And in 2026, the ingredients for that pressure are already visible. BLS-BEA. So, the practical move here is not panic investing. It is household disinflation. Lower your fixed commitments. Shorten the list of things that can surprise you. Reduce exposure to variable rate debt. Reprice your insurance. Rethink transportation costs. Upgrade efficiency before aesthetics. And assume that any budget built on last year's prices is lying to you. Because in stagflation light, the winner is not the person who predicts the next CPI print. It's the person who makes their monthly life harder to inflate. And number one, the scenario almost nobody is emotionally prepared for, is the bond market becoming the hidden boss of the entire economy. This is the strongest insight in the whole video, so stay with me. Most Americans still think the economy works like this. The Fed moves rates. Stocks react. Maybe mortgages follow. Washington argues. Life goes on. But in 2026, the deeper story is fiscal gravity. CBO projects a federal deficit of $1.9 trillion this year. Debt held by the public at 101% of GDP. Net interest outlays above $1 trillion. And CBO explicitly warns that large and growing debt raises borrowing costs across the economy, crowds out private investment, makes the fiscal position more vulnerable to rate increases, and raises the risk of a loss of investor confidence in U.S. government debt. That should get more attention than it does. Because once interest expense itself becomes one of the biggest lines in the national budget, the government is no longer just managing the economy. It is reacting to the cost of financing its own past decisions. And when debt rolls over at higher rates, that pressure does not stay in Washington. It leaks into treasury yields, into mortgage rates, into business borrowing costs, into auto loans, into commercial real estate refinancing, into bank balance sheets, into the political pressure for taxes, cuts, financial repression, or more inflation tolerance. That's why this is the number one scenario. Not because America suddenly defaults tomorrow, but because a high-debt, high-interest world changes how every other economic problem behaves. A weak labor market becomes harder to rescue. A housing slowdown becomes harder to offset. A consumer squeeze becomes more persistent. A geopolitical shock becomes more expensive. And a recession, if it arrives, becomes less straightforward to fight. But here's the real problem. A lot of people still assume that if the economy weakens, policymakers will simply step in the way they did before. Maybe. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not at the same speed. And maybe not without consequences that hit households elsewhere. That is what people are not ready for. Not the end of the dollar. Not some cinematic collapse. Just a future where policy choices get narrower, slower, and more compromised because the financing math is uglier than most people want to admit. Even the IMF, while projecting 2.4% growth in 2026 and unemployment near 4% in its baseline, still says the US fiscal deficit is expected to remain around 7 to 7.5% of GDP, with debt continuing to climb in the medium term. In other words, even the relatively calm forecast still sits on top of a very large fiscal imbalance. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think the biggest risk is that one thing snaps. The bigger risk is that nothing snaps cleanly. Instead, the debt story sits in the background and quietly changes the price of almost everything. Your mortgage is not just about housing. Your savings yield is not just about discipline. Your business loan is not just about your company. Your tax outlook is not just about elections. Your retirement portfolio is not just about stocks. All of it is connected to the cost of money in a country carrying a huge amount of debt. So what is the action rule? It's this. In 2026, optimize for resilience before return. That means more liquidity than feels impressive, less dependence on refinancing, less dependence on one income stream, less dependence on the idea that policymakers will always make asset prices your safety net. Think shorter duration. Think stronger cash flow. Think lower fixed monthly obligations. Think optionality. Because when the bond market becomes the hidden boss, freedom belongs to the household that needs the least rescue. And if you zoom out, that's the real message of all 5 scenarios. The danger in 2026 is not that America suddenly looks poor. It's that normal people can start feeling poorer inside a system that still looks functional. A frozen housing market can trap you. A fractured consumer economy can isolate you. A soft labor slowdown can weaken you before it scares you. Stagflation light can quietly train you to live smaller. And fiscal pressure can make every solution more expensive. So don't prepare for one giant event. Prepare for a long negotiation with uncertainty. That means keeping a real emergency fund, reducing high-interest debt aggressively, building one backup income stream, making major purchases based on durability, not status, avoiding financial commitments that only work in perfect conditions, and treating flexibility as a form of wealth. Because security in this economy is not about predicting the future perfectly. It's about making sure fewer futures can break you. If you felt this shift already in your own budget, your job, your housing decisions, or your debt load, drop a comment and tell me which of these 5 scenarios feels most real where you live. And if you want more videos that break down the economy in plain English without the sugarcoating, subscribe now. Because 2026 is not the year to confuse calm headlines with real safety.